Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi up there. Good evening and welcome to the launch of the Affordable Housing Challenge Project's report, Advancing the Right to Housing in Toronto, Critical Perspectives on the GTA's Housing Crisis and How to Solve It. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here on this December evening at such a busy time of the year. And this is our first in-person event since the pandemic, so it's wonderful to see you all in person. So great to be back in live interaction. I'm Susannah Bunce. I'm an associate professor in geography and planning here at the University of Toronto, and I'm also the co-director of the Affordable Housing Challenge Project, otherwise known by its acronym AHCP. My colleague, Dr. Alan Hawes, right here, is also a professor of geography and planning at U of T and the other co-director of the AHCP. We have an exciting panel discussion tonight, and we'll introduce our moderator, Emily Hawes, and panelists in a moment. But first, we wanted to honor this land and say a few words about the AHCP as a project of the University of Toronto School of Cities. So the topics we're here to talk about tonight: the great lack of deeply affordable housing in the city, the displacement and exclusion of lower income, homeless, and housing vulnerable communities from large swaths of the city, and the ever-rising cost of housing and cost of living in Toronto are also a consequence of colonialism, dispossession, and displacement in Canada. The land on which we are in relation with today was taken from the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, communities that for countless generations have passed on the lesson that this land must be stewarded by all who take part in using it. Much of this land we know as Toronto was treated and taken by colonialists who divided and subdivided it and sold and resold it to the highest bidders. Today in Toronto, the right to determine how land is stewarded and cared for is still denied to Indigenous and other communities living with it, and land continues to be taken by the highest bidder. The right to determine who gets to live where, on what bits of land, and who gets the right to a home and who gets evicted is granted to the wealthier residents of the city. We all need to honor, steward, and relate to this land that we are part of. It is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. We are mindful of broken covenants, and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other. Many of us here tonight have come to Toronto as refugees, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or in generations past. We must particularly honor those of us whose ancestors came here forcibly, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Thus, we honor ancestors and communities of African origin and descent. We hope that this statement helps to guide thinking about what it might mean to decolonize Toronto. To wrestle the control of land use from settlers who view land simply as a means to inflate their private wealth, and instead to place it in the hands of Indigenous and other communities who will steward it collectively. Hopefully, this might be a topic of conversation tonight. So I'll pass it over now to my colleague, Alan Hawes, who will say a few words about the AHCP and also introduce our moderator for tonight, Emily Hawes, who will introduce our panelists. So Alan.
Thanks, Sue. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all here. My name's Alan Hawes, and I always introduce myself the same way. My name, it's a grammatically correct sentence. I'm one of the few people on the planet that can claim that. Everyone gets their 15 seconds of fame. It's pretty lame, but that's my 15 seconds. It's true, and I always also mention to my classes that it's fitting because I love to walk and I also love to bike, and I should have been named Alan Walks and Bikes, but that wasn't the case. Anyway, so thank you for the introduction. Sue and I, we've been co-leading the Affordable Housing Challenge project now throughout the pandemic. We started in the before times, back when people, got together like this and in person, and there was no pandemic on the horizon. When from the beginning, we really sought to make our project support alternative voices and a diversity of perspectives, and really distinguish it from other similar kinds of projects that have been going on in the city. Not that those other projects don't have something to offer, but there's been insufficient attention to the plight of low-income communities. There's been insufficient attention to the issues of land price inflation, financialization, a lack of affordable housing, and the rest of it. And so we've really tried to make our project a bit distinct. Over the last 3 years, I think we've held 16 or something panel events. We've used our space to support community organizations to organize and in part to resist changes in policy and housing policies. We got together with Mark Fox, who's here. Thank you for coming, Mark. We got together and started discussing the Affordable Housing Challenge Project back, I guess it was 2019. When we were doing that, we really thought, if we're going to do this, we want to make a difference, a real difference in the lives of Torontonians, and especially low-income and marginalized communities. And we thought this was a good opportunity to support the fledgling emergence of alternate non-market forms of housing like community land trusts. And I think we're really proud to have supported Kensington Market Community Land Trust and other community land trusts over the course of the pandemic and our work, right? So I also just want to say, when thinking through our approach and comparing it to the kind of work that is being done elsewhere, as I mentioned, those other kinds of institutes and other things have their place, but many have been basically putting forward the development industry perspective. Not to say that everything that they have said is wrong, but we kind of feel that the current last 6 months particularly has kind of vindicated our perspective, which is that their focus on their main focus on boosting the supply of owner-occupied housing was clearly wrong. The development industry perspective is one that says there's not enough owner-occupied housing, we got to build more. Bill 23, which we might even be discussing a little bit tonight by the Ford government, is an attempt to allow developers to cut their costs and get things to market quicker. But the truth is, ever since interest rates started rising, there's now a glut of housing on the market. There's clearly not a problem with the supply of owner-occupied housing. There's tons of it. It's just not selling. The issue is not a supply of owner-occupied housing. The issue is the cost. Most people can't afford it. And why? The speculators were the ones driving up the cost. They were borrowing against existing property, maxing out their expenditures, driving up the cost, and everyone else then had to go into massive debt in order to compete with the speculators. Yes, there was like bidding wars and everything else, but it was often the speculators that were setting the price. And what's happened? Since interest rates have gone up, speculators have left the scene. Speculators are not taking out higher interest loans to buy assets that are declining in value. And so it's now left to people that just want a place to live, and the average Canadian can't afford that. That's why you have so much housing there. The issue is the cost. We do have a supply issue, though. The supply issue is not in the realm of owner-occupied housing. It's in the realm of rental housing. There's a real drastic supply, particularly affordable rental housing. We actually have a glut of rental housing in the condo market. When the pandemic happened, a lot of people who had bought condos to rent out in the long-term market or the short-term market for that matter, put their condos on the market. They tried to sell them because the Airbnb market had dried up. One of the organizers, Sean Grisdale, at the back there, has done some research on Airbnb in Toronto and has found that you can make 2 to 3 times putting your condo on the short-term or the Airbnb market than you can in the long-term market. That's what was happening. So it's not that there's a lack of units. It's the price and the place that they're located. Anyway, so with our project, we really sought to promote alternate forms of housing, community land trusts, and other kinds of things. And we're really, really proud to launch this report now, and to you all. So without further ado, I will introduce our moderator, who's in front of me, Emily Hawes. Emily Hawes is a PhD candidate here at the University of Toronto and was the editor who was really spearheading the report. So this report couldn't have occurred without Emily. She was the one who got in touch with all the contributors and organized with them and collected everything. And anyway, so we're really, really proud that Emily is here to moderate the panel event. So with that, I will hand over the mic to Emily, and you can take it away. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. There we go. So yeah, it's really great to see everybody here tonight. Thank you so much for coming out. It's exciting because, as Sue and Alan mentioned, our collective started before the pandemic, but it's been a long time since we've been able to have an in-person event, so it's just really great to see you all here, and especially our collaborators on the report who I've been in touch with a lot over the last couple of years, but haven't seen their faces in a long time, so this is exciting. So I'm happy to introduce our first panelist, Nemoy Lewis. Nemoy is an assistant professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Toronto Metropolitan University. He received his PhD in Human Geography from Queen's University and his undergraduate and graduate degrees in geography from the University of Toronto. Nemoy's current research focuses on the impacts of financialization and evictions on Black renters in Toronto during the pandemic, as well as the barriers to home ownership faced by Black Canadians in the GTHA. Nemoy contributed a chapter to the report titled Reclaiming Housing Affordability Towards a Definancialized Rental Market. In it, he tracks the financialization of Toronto's apartment stock by real estate investment trusts, asset managers, and pension funds, and links this to poor housing conditions and rising rents. He calls for a rent freeze, strong rent controls, greater decision-making power by tenants, and the deconsolidation of apartment stock controlled by financialized landlords. Next, we have Julie Ma. Julie is an assistant professor in the City Studies program at the University of Toronto Scarborough. She received her PhD and Master of Science in Planning degrees from the University of Toronto. And Julie was also a postdoctoral fellow with the U of T Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, where she published reports on affordable housing, density bonusing, and evictions. Her current research focuses on gentrification and evictions in Ontario and the potential for value capture policies to create affordable housing in Toronto. And Julie contributed a chapter to the report titled Housing Impacts of COVID-19, an Evictions Crisis in the Making, written with Martine August, who's also here tonight. In it, they drew on historical evictions data from the Landlord and Tenant Board to predict the neighborhoods likely to experience the highest rates of eviction and displacement during the pandemic. Julie and Martine critique the eviction moratoria policy as a stopgap solution and call for rent forgiveness, a universal right to legal counsel, stronger rent control, and large-scale investment in affordable housing. We're also lucky to have with us Keisha St. Louis-McBurnie. Keisha is an urban planner and researcher in Toronto. She graduated from the Master of Science in Planning program at the University of Toronto in 2021 and currently works at Urban Strategies on planning projects across the GTA. She previously served on the Ontario Professional Institute of Planners Anti-Black Racism and Planning Task Force and is a sessional instructor in the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. And with co-author Chiyi Tam, Keisha contributed a chapter to the report titled Anti-Displacement from Little Jamaica to Chinatown. This chapter explores how Toronto's planning policies result in the systematic gentrification of working-class diasporic neighborhoods. It also highlights the role of grassroots organizations Black Urbanism TO and Friends of Chinatown in fighting the displacement of commercial and residential tenants through their exploration of community land trusts. And finally, Chiyi Tam joins us as well. Chiyi is an urban planner and an anti-gentrification organizer. She graduated from the Master of Science in Planning program at the University of Toronto, also in 2021. She's currently the executive director of the Kensington Market Community Land Trust, and she also organizes with the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust. So Chiyi and Keisha also recently developed and taught a course for the Daniels School of Architecture titled Planning and Designing for Community Power, which I think sounds really cool. All right, so thanks so much, you guys, for joining us again and for collaborating on this report. I think this report really developed throughout the pandemic, and initially we thought it was going to be sort of a much shorter and more straightforward report, still trying to live up to all the things that Alan mentioned, but it really took on a life of its own as we received these rich, beautiful contributions from this wealth of knowledge that we have in the U of T community. So I'm so excited that everyone here is here joining us tonight, and thank you so much again for your contributions. So first we thought it would be great to just get a sense of each of your contributions to the report, just by going through. I'll ask you a couple of questions to prompt you, but please do feel free to just add extra context and detail or explain any key concepts if you think it's necessary from your pieces, but otherwise feel free to stick to the questions as posed. So I think we'll start with Nemoy, and then we'll go to Julie and follow up with Keisha and Chiyi. Okay, so Nemoy, in your chapter on the financialization of rental housing, you provide some really helpful statistics on the share of Toronto's apartment stock that's controlled by financialized landlords. 20 years ago, you say the top 10 financialized landlords owned 6,000 apartments. Today, the top 10 firms control more than 70,000 apartments in the city. So maybe you could just start by telling us about who are some of the biggest players, which parts of the city are they targeting for building acquisitions, and any other kind of details you want to throw in there.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. So very good question. So when I started this research, I was very intrigued about, where financialized landlords were acquiring their units. And particularly why I was interested in exploring this issue was because I'm from a community, from the Little Jamaica community, in which is experiencing significant acquisitions across the city. A significant acquisition in this part of the city with the new Eglinton LRT crosstown. And I wanted to understand, whether these were happening in various other parts of the city. And so some of the biggest players, I'll speak to this particular community, which is within the former borough of the city of York, which currently financialized landlords have a 63% market share in this particular, and that grew significantly following the announcement of the Eglinton LRT, in where at the announcement in 2007, financialized landlords accounted for 20%, just under 20% of the market share of this particular community. By the time of construction, that number nearly doubled to just under 40, and today it's about 63%, with Starlight Investment being the largest financialized landlord in this part of the city. Starlight Investment is the largest landlord in this city, and where nearly half of their portfolio is actually within this city, and where they own approximately just over 22,000 rental units. Just to put that in perspective, the second most is about 7,000. And so Starlight actually has about a 10% market share. Prior to them taking TransGlobe REIT private in 2012, they owned about 5%, and within that same time frame from 2012 to 2022, they've increased their share about just over 5%. And they're not doing this alone. They've actually also joined forces with one of the world's largest private equity firm, Blackstone Group, and where they did a number of joint ventures. So some of the largest players are Starlight Investment, Cap REIT, Hazelview, Homestead. Trying to think of some others. Achilles. But the other thing that I was also intrigued about is, we talk a lot about REITs having a good share of the market, but after doing a lot of research and analysis through the data, REITs actually own 7%. 7% of the market here in Toronto. The biggest players are asset management firms, in where they owned about 32%. And so I think that there should be a significant more attention paid to financial intermediaries like asset management firms. And this has become such a lucrative business in the fact that some of these companies have started their own development arm to build purpose-built rentals. And I believe Starlight has just over 3,000 units in the pipeline right now, and Cap REIT has just under 1,200. So just to give you a sense of the direction and where this market is going.
Thank you. Those are some shocking figures. And just a follow-up question, in case there are people who are less familiar, or I know people haven't had a chance to read the report yet, maybe just briefly tell us why this is not a good thing. Maybe it sounds like a good thing to some people, that people want to invest in purpose-built rental.
Why is this not a good thing is because of the fact that a lot of these companies, they're in it to maximize profits. And one of the questions I always get asked is, these particular landlords are helping to improve the quality of living in these units. They're helping to improve the quality of life in these communities. But let's make it let's keep it a buck. Like, they're not doing this for free. Their interest is to maximize profits, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to do so. And so, when we think about why this is a bad thing, is because when you're trying to maximize profits, you have to keep high occupancy and high rents. And that means that these particular business practices exacerbate the affordability and displacement problems in a number of vulnerable communities. I've seen this a lot in terms of my research, and I can get into more in talking about where specifically in the city of Toronto and where this is happening.
I mean, feel free to do that right now if you want, or we can save it for later.
So one of the things in study, and also similar to Julie, I'm not going to stomp on your. I study evictions as well in AGIs, and so within the last couple of months, my colleague, my research assistant Dimitri, who's here as well in the front row, has helped me manually clean 63,000 eviction data, eviction filings, to assign the correct owners to the actual eviction. And one of the things that the research is showing is that there's year over year, there's a concentration of eviction in 3 parts of the city. One being the North Albion community, in one particular building, 2737, 2757 Kipling Avenue, which is currently owned by Starlight Investment. Another being 10 San Hermano Way in Jane and Finch, is another particular area that has experienced a significant amount of evictions. And the third being the Chalk Farm community, in where they've year over year received a significant number of evictions. Those buildings are owned by the Greenwin family, which is a family office or a family business. But don't let the name family fool you, because it helps to humanize their business practices. There's nothing nice about what they do. And the building at 10 San Hermano Way, which has experienced a significant amount of evictions, is owned by Cap REIT. And just to give you a sense of, in terms of the different types of applications that are filed year over year, one particular building, 2737 Kipling, 98% of the eviction applications are L1 applications. 98%.
Someone asked what an L1 is.
These are evictions for non-payment of rent.
In your report, you raised, first of all, a number of really interesting measures that you think you could use to tackle this sort of issue. And I encourage everyone to read Nemoy's piece in the report. I won't ask you to list them all, but you do reference a recent referendum in Germany where the population voted to expropriate the holdings of any landlord that holds more than 3,000 apartments as a way to push back against this consolidation of the market by financialized companies. Do you think a similar policy could be adopted in Toronto? What do you think it might look like?
As much as I want to remain optimistic, I don't think so with this current provincial government. And we see the direction that they're going with Bill 23. But even, I should talk about that even a year after the referendum, they still have, in Berlin, they still haven't, put particular policies in place to kickstart that. And in fact, the mayor of Berlin, who was elected prior to the referendum, opposed the idea and continues to oppose. And now they have started commission a report to examine the the legality of the particular referendum, and they've pretty much trying to stall any actions to be taken. So in terms of what can be done, I think that I definitely think that we need to start to put a cap in terms of the units that many of these companies have under management, because of the fact that what's happening now, especially in the city of Toronto, financialized landlords account for 54% of the market share of units that were sold since 1995. And so what that indicates to me is that the market is still ripe for an oligopolistic rental market, in where you have a few number of players that are in control of the rental units in the city. And that doesn't really help in terms of providing, in terms of competition, and helping to reduce rents in this city. So definitely, I think that we need to put a cap in terms of the number of units, especially like companies like Starlight Investment, who continues to acquire some of the portfolios of the smaller financialized landlords who don't have this sort of capital to engage in capital-intensive, value-added strategies to convert older purpose-built rentals into more newer style, condominium-style living to attract more affluent and higher income renters to those particular buildings.
Right, so it's not just a consolidation of the housing stock, but it's a consolidation of power behind that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. That's a really rich start to the discussion, and I'm happy to go to Julie now. Your turn. So we know that the pandemic exposed issues that Toronto tenants have been facing for years, and this is maybe because the issues were more widespread, or maybe just because the media picked them up a little bit more during the pandemic. But Julie, your chapter on the pandemic evictions crisis describes major issues with the Landlord and Tenant Board Tribunal, also funding for legal aid and tenant organizing, and a lack of access and transparency for evictions data. So could you describe for us kind of how these issues were highlighted and exacerbated during the pandemic?
Yes, can you hear me okay? Yeah, perfect, thank you. I always ask that at the start of a class. Can you hear me in the back? First, I'd like to acknowledge Martine August was my partner in crime in this, and also I'm lucky enough to kind of work with her on the evictions research, looking at the role of financialized landlords in driving evictions, how that relates to sort of gentrification patterns. And so I came to this work as well when I was looking at gentrification and evictions in Detroit, and saw how it was within gentrifying areas how people were being pushed out to the periphery. So I was wondering, when I did obtain some evictions data to understand what was happening, and then the pandemic happened. So then kind of looking, then I got sort of looking at data during the pandemic, and really COVID, just as it did with many issues, shone a light on existing inequalities, and really just amplified and deepened those inequalities, and showed how when people couldn't work because of the lockdown and they couldn't pay the rent, how that was so tied to housing precarity. And then once you can't pay the rent and you now behind 1 month, 2 months, it's very hard to get caught up. And then on top of that, the penalties are being added. It's very hard for you to be caught up. So if you look at the CMHC rental market studies in 2020 and 2021, in Ontario has the highest rates of rental arrears in the country. So at 10%, so 10% of units, I guess within the 10% of units in the province are experiencing rental arrears. So 10% of those units, but then within the Toronto CMA, it's like we're just over 34,000 households were experiencing rental arrears. So that's a significant number, and that's over these 2 years as well. So the issue is not going away, and I guess you could also ask why Ontario has the highest rate, especially, yeah, it's most populous, but if you look at the second highest was Alberta. Anyways, I'll let you kind of draw your own conclusions. But so just like talking in terms of how it exacerbated in terms of that and how it was just disproportionately born so in terms of the negative impacts of COVID and sort of that increased likelihood that someone might experience eviction, that was disproportionately borne by communities of color, by women. Women lost jobs at a much higher rate than men, and their recovery, their economic recovery was a lot slower and has been a lot slower as well. And then we saw, like in the report, it kind of shows how the incidence of evictions and the prevalence of evictions is mostly concentrated in neighborhood improvement areas, right? So then additional, like, well, we could talk more about the research that Martine and I've been doing. Martine's been doing a great job kind of going through, is it like 240,000 eviction filings now with ownership? So it's a lot, and just tying the AGIs, which above guideline increases, to actually linking them to the eviction filings to see what are the impacts of AGIs on rental affordability and on eviction filings. So we're looking at just L1 and L4. So L1 is for non-payment of rent. L4 is there a breach in mediated agreements to kind of see like how is it driving that over time in looking at sort of like a pre-AGI eviction filing rate versus the post-AGI eviction filing rate. How does the sales transactions within that time period also affect what is happening in terms of displacement, but also the increase in rents. I think like your study, Martine, with Phil Zygmunt, really kind of highlighted how it can be compounded over time. So looking at the orders, you can kind of see what are the percentage increases, and then how does that affect the rental increases at a building level. So we're kind of going down into the building level analysis to see what does this really mean? Looking at the big picture, but then zooming down. I think that's sort of very long
No, it's
answer
great.
to that.
I think you anticipated my next question, which
Okay.
was, why do we still care about this? Because a lot of people think the pandemic has maybe ended, but as you say, evictions go on and the impacts of this are lasting.
Yeah, and it's like, the thing is when we'll talk about like sort of the access to data, so it is hard to access, but it's also like piecing together like a puzzle and then trying to create like a database. And I'm also lucky enough that Sue and Alan have invited me to be part of the SHRC Partnership Grant, where we can create an eviction prevention lab to kind of create a comprehensive database to bring together all of the different pieces of the picture, so then you can actually start answering certain questions. That's the problem, is that we don't really know what the extent of the problem is. To understand the impacts of the pandemic, we need to understand what was the problem before, and then compare, and now we can properly assess what was it during the pandemic, and now after that, what are the impacts. But we didn't really, it's very difficult to kind of understand that based on the access to data that we have. So we've also got data for the entire province. We're going to be looking at different housing markets, and just seeing like what are the business practices and how do they change within the different housing markets, which is perhaps we'll gain a better understanding of the problem in that way. But that's the thing, it's like if you want to do evidence-based policy making, you first need the evidence, right? And it doesn't seem like they really have the evidence. They're making all these changes, these legislative changes, but what is the research or that's kind of driving that? Like, what are they basing these decisions on?
Mm-hmm. The data is so fragmented, as you said, and hard to get. That sounds like a very valuable evictions prevention lab. Is that what you said?
Or I think, yeah, something.
Yeah, something like that. That's exciting. That's exciting.
Yeah, in progress.
We'll get back to you about that. Okay, thank you so much, Julie.
Thanks.
So I'll hand it over to Chiyi and Keisha now. And as we talked about before the panel, if you want to each tackle it separately or however you want to do it, you guys. So in your chapter, you described the displacement threats faced by commercial and residential tenants in Chinatown and Little Jamaica in large part thanks to the city planning initiatives that have branded these neighborhoods and upzoned properties to make them more attractive to investors and developers. So there's a theme emerging this evening. And I just wanted to say that I really, really appreciated your contribution to the report because you do bring out the importance of not just residential tenants, but also the importance of commercial tenants and the pressures that they're also facing, which is something that came up in the news, I think, in a way during the pandemic. We know that a lot of small businesses had to close, but your piece really has tells a rich story about certain communities and the pressures that they've been going through for far longer. So maybe as you answer these questions, if you want to just bring a little bit of that out and explain why that commercial real estate is also very important, that'd be really great. But so first, what makes these neighborhoods important? I'd love for you to touch on that. But also, in what ways do you think current approaches to city planning, like heritage planning, cultural districts, density bonusing, fall short when it comes to addressing the concerns of these tenants in neighborhoods like Chinatown and Little Jamaica? What are instead some more meaningful actions the city could be taking?
I can go first, Chi, and then you can pick up wherever. Chi and I had the privilege of beginning to do this research when we were students in the Master of Science in Planning program here at U of T. Specifically, in our planning program, we have a final studio workshop class where, students are broken up into small groups and we are assigned clients. And so in this situation, Chi's group's client was Friends of Chinatown, and in my situation, our client was Black Urbanism Toronto. And during this time, both of our groups were actually dealing with really similar questions, which is, how do we plan for community control in neighborhoods that are undergoing such significant change as a result of planning policy? And so, this really begins with a larger understanding about the role of the province in setting our planning framework, which right now is focused on how do we plan for growth in new people and jobs, and what are matters of provincial interest as it relates to this, specifically economic development and housing supply. And so, because we are a creature of the province, we are obligated as a city to make sure that our official plan policies conform with those objectives. And so right now, the overarching direction from the province is to grow in relation to new planned transportation and existing transportation. And so in the case of Chinatown, there's existing transportation, which is the streetcar that goes right down Spadina. And for Little Jamaica, as Nemoy was describing, that's the incoming Eglinton West LRT. And as we plan around transit, there is a really structural focus on the layering of policy objectives. And so here, for example, in Little Jamaica itself along Eglinton is an avenue. And an avenue is a place where growth is intended to go. And on top of that, we have major transit station areas, which again are higher density places for growth to take place, and as well as secondary plans, which really are looking to develop high density development in certain areas. And so in Little Jamaica, you have this really intense state-led objective for growth in an area where you have predominantly mixed-use buildings that are lower rise with commercial at the base, maybe a couple of residential units above those commercial units. And in this situation for Little Jamaica, very few Black-owned businesses actually own their commercial spaces. Most of those folks are leasing. And second to that, most of these mixed-use buildings do not have 5 or more residential units atop of them, which means they are not subject to rental replacement policies. And so as the land value of this commercial strip rises and is bought up by folks who are speculating to develop as a result of the transit, you end up losing these commercial spaces, as well as the affordable housing, the relatively affordable housing that was present for community members. And so we're beginning to see community organizations organize in response to this growth and change. One way that we're thinking through these things are through land trusts. I think there's a made-in neighborhood solution to these things. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But really what we're seeing is, again, state-led gentrification. And a large part of that is because, as other folks in the report explore, we do not actually structurally adopt a human rights-based approach to housing, which starts at the provincial level. It means we need to have planning policies that we are required to conform with and advance through a human rights-based perspective, and that needs to trickle down into our subsequent planning policies, and we don't see that quite yet. And so as we're organizing around anti-displacement, there is both a top-down solution with that policy, but also bottom-up organizing that we're seeing with folks like Black Urbanism Toronto and Friends of Chinatown. Chiyi, if you want to speak more to heritage and those types of policies.
Yeah. Who are you all? Like, how familiar are you all with the concept of Little Jamaica? Show of hands. Would you feel extremely comfortable telling the story of how it came to be at a dinner party?
Lots of nods.
Okay. How about Chinatown? Would you feel incredibly confident speaking to that?
More nods.
But it's still a fraction of the audience, so maybe that helps me gauge like how in depth is necessary to go into. So in every North American city, it feels like on Turtle Island, marginalized groups were thrown into a very specific downtown core context to be marginalized together, to be literally forced to live in a specific ward. In Toronto, it was called the ward. In other places, it was called other horrendous things. And so you would very typically have a shared narrative of a Black, a Jewish, or a Chinese neighborhood that has a freeway project that is run down the center of it in order to evict it, in order to completely wholesale displace it. This happens again and again and again, and in Toronto, that isn't particularly unique. What is very clear in the contrast between working with the organizers of Little Jamaica and Chinatown, and now I've like fully become a core organizer with Friends of Chinatown Toronto, is seeing how transformative property ownership has been to retain our second Chinatown in place at Spadina and Dundas. The difference is that a large amount of culturally East Asian retail businesses do own the building that they operate in Chinatown. They themselves don't own it. They lease it from a benevolent society, from a family association, from a union, from a Freemasons group. So these are groups that have never needed the terminology community land trust to describe the alternative ownership that has always been in place in order to retain and access property ownership. And I don't really know what us as academics and planners really contribute if I were to like go have tea with an elder on a porch and explain to them what you're doing is a community land trust. It's so sick. Like what does that offer them? It doesn't offer them anything. So sometimes I really struggle with this idea that like I'm this anti-gentrification person that like is like a leader in community land trust movements now by way of them giving me this job and this opportunity. Like what does that offer our cultural communities to say that like we're hijacking all of these like new vogue trendy ideas when this type of mutual aid has been done by necessity for so long as a survival mechanism, because the answer to like why these neighborhoods are important and also how do they relate to all of this policy discussion is that it's just never been about us. And when you layer on this level of like racist immigration policy with the horrific expropriations and stealing from the colonial Canadian government of point to any ethnic minority, and this has happened to them, but by far and large the most egregious obviously being the actual settling of Indigenous land and remaking it into private property. That's where like the existence of Chinatown as a story becomes incredibly interesting, because now you have an example of what it means to actually say, we actually just need to do something in the meantime that has nothing to do with advocating towards policymakers, nothing to do with wasting our time and energy trying to convince politicians that have no interest in our community to do something. That will exhaust all of our time, all of the donated funds that you can raise in your community with karaoke nights, with like all of these ridiculous mental gymnastics that you go through. And at the end of it, the opportunity to speak at city council once and hope that maybe something happens. In the end, they bulldozed Chinatown anyway, you know? And in the end, Blackhurst was not able to remain at College and near Kensington Market, and then moved up towards Eglinton. Like most people don't even know that there was a prior Little Jamaica to the current location, and that's a similar story with Chinatown. So, I don't know, state-led gentrification is such a succinct way of saying it, but the thing that we encounter a lot is like, there are so many people out there who think that gentrification is somehow like organic. Like it's like some kind of this like natural process that all cities experience because it's an ecosystem, and there's this metaphor that it's like this ecosystem where, you know, species like compete with each other, and it's like, no, there are actual policies that leave specific people behind. And if you overlay a map, which we do in our essay from the reports that we worked on, if you look at specifically where people are not protected by heritage policies, it's pockets. If you just actually spatially lay out all of the downtown core growth plans, the transit plans, the avenue plans, which communities have been forced to live on avenues, which communities have been forced to live next to freeways, which ones. Transit-oriented development in a way is just this generation's freeway planning, it feels like, it functions exactly the same to displace cultural community. And so when you look at the actual heritage planning system, Chinatowns amazingly have the most experience with advocating and failing, seeing the heritage system fail us. The amazing thing about doing Chinatown organizing is that I have this depth of access to generations and generations of 100 years of Chinatown organizing. People have never not been fighting for Chinatowns to exist. And from that history, people tell you, don't waste your time trying to get a UNESCO certification. Don't waste your time trying to convince the city to give you a heritage designation. In the end, they protect your building facade and then evict all your elders out of the space anyway. But still there are people in Chinatown that are obsessed with this because it helps their property values, because it creates more tourism. It's a very diverse, obviously, community with many different ideas around how we could preserve the neighborhood. And so it's still a strategy that I respect and I see people in my community put a lot of faith in. But at the same time, we have historically literally just raised funds together, remortgaged our houses individually, and bought property for each other. And so I guess that's the context we're sitting in. There's only so much that heritage planning can offer us, but still, I think we all should watch very, very carefully where this new definition of cultural heritage is going to go in Toronto. There's an opportunity here to do something completely unprecedented and interesting in the North American planning context, but we just don't know. We don't know, and Little Jamaica, unfortunately, is now the guinea pig for all of Toronto to see what the hell is going to be this cultural heritage framework policy that the City of Toronto comes out with.
If I can just quickly add, Emily, I was going to say the distinction here is that, traditionally heritage policies protect built forms, so architectural significance. In places like Little Jamaica, where you do not technically per the government's interpretation of what constitutes architectural significance, there are no buildings in Little Jamaica that have their own distinct architecture, and thus they are not physically worthy of heritage protection. And so, people have been organizing to think about other ways to keep Little Jamaica in its place, given the limitations of what Chiyi is describing in terms of built or tangible heritage. And so the City of Toronto is undertaking its own process to explore what cultural heritage preservation could look like in ways that capture intangible heritage. But again, it does not stop people from not physically being in place and or protecting the physicality of the Little Jamaica. Like Little Jamaica, as a result, could exist anywhere. If folks all just move somewhere else, that new place would be Little Jamaica, as opposed to keeping it directly on Eglinton West within the bounds that it currently is today. And so there's lots of tricky policy problems there that we're kind of working through and waiting for the City of Toronto to come forward with something to see what that looks like.
I just wanted to build on that because I grew up on Eglinton West, and I think we should all be very wary of cultural districts. We don't know what that is and what that entails. And the reason why I say that is because there's been similar instances where these particular strategies have been carried out in places like Washington, D.C., in the District of Columbia, and in places like Harlem, and where you have this memorialization of blackness without black people actually being present to be there. And so I think that we should be definitely wary of these cultural designations, because I think one of the questions that I always ask is, how does this help to keep people in their communities? It's great if you can, you create these designations, but my concern is that how these particular cultural district designations then become market employees or marketing, used as a marketing tool to attract particular folks to this community. And we see it in terms of these particular strategies carried out in Harlem, and where you have a celebration of blackness, but Black people have actually been removed from some of these communities.
Thank you all for that. I know that it's maybe, so you touched on a lot of things there. You touched on organizing and maybe the frustrations around longstanding organizing and mutual aid, but maybe if we can, I don't know, look for not necessarily optimism, but just on the positive side of the question, what are some community practices that you think can help, or even on the policy side, what are some things that you really think can help any of these issues or the housing crisis at large in Toronto? And I'll open that up to everybody. But it looks like Chiyi might want to start.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate to be able to reflect very often on my organizing work. I think the thing about 100 years of Chinatown organizing has been that our community has gone through all the motions and still produced so many Chinese politicians that are incredibly conservative. You know, like ownership itself will not heal the trauma is I guess the way to actually transform this strategy to the current generation of organizing. And I hoped that other groups will be able to leapfrog, you know, the many generations of limited vision that Chinatown's mutual aid has offered purely to itself. Necessary at the time, but at this point, it's clear to me that organizing has a role for us because it emotively gives us something back. Like it is too exhausting to be fighting all the time, one development application at a time, one tenant policy at the time, and then to see that policy that you finally push through be repealed by the next government that's elected. It just is too exhausting for your soul. And I can do that work if it's a fraction of my work. If the majority of my time is actually sitting in community and feeling like dialogue is happening, is feeling like people are actually talking to their neighbors, and finding that mutual aid and care, then it actually becomes possible to live, it feels like, which is really what the housing crisis really robs from us, is this will to live and the ability to actually just stay alive. Yeah.
A tough answer to follow, but hopefully someone will volunteer.
I think one of the things in my work that I've been doing as well is, I think, especially around tenant activism, I think that we, when we think about tenant activism, I think that tenant activism should be joined with some of the activism that's going on in the labor movement, in the labor sector. And one of the things that I do is I try to encourage labor unions to expand their activities beyond advocating for better living wages. I think that tenant unions and labor unions should be working closely together, largely because one of the biggest investors in financial intermediaries like private equity firms and asset management firms is pension funds. And I think that labor unions can play an active role in terms of joining forces in advocating for a disinvestment of their pensions from these particular entities, but also a disinvestment in terms of the multifamily rental space. Currently, right now, there's three pension funds that are quite active in the city, which is PSP, which is the federal government, which manages the pension funds of federal employees, which has a huge stake and investment in Starlight Investments. So essentially, they are financing a lot of these acquisitions, and I think indirectly they're financing a lot of the evictions in our communities as well. Another company is AIMCO, which is the Alberta, which is the management arm of the Alberta Public Pension Fund, as well. They actually own some of their buildings outright, and they're actually engaged in helping Hazelview construct their rental empire. And another company is BCIMC, which is the management arm of the BC public sector. And they're also engaged in a lot of acquisitions and a lot of AGIs. In fact, since 2012, BCIMC is the third most applicant of AGIs in the city of Toronto. And so just to give you a sense that your pension fund could be working against you, and it could be working to create a lot of the violence that you see within your communities in terms of evictions and also housing insecurity. So definitely I think that I encourage a lot of alliances with tenant unions and labor unions. But I also encourage us as researchers to work more with community groups in terms of helping to do a lot of the research. I know Chiyi talked about in terms of how trying to challenge various policies and how that takes away from the work that they're really good at on the ground. And I think that in terms of researchers, I think that we can, play a helping hand in terms of providing them with some of the research to advance some of the campaigns that they have around a human rights-based approach to housing. So those are some of the things that I think that, from an activist standpoint, I think those are the things that we could do, and also working collectively with other tenant unions and understanding who owns what and doing collective rent strikes across the city to disrupt a lot of the profit forecasting of a lot of these companies. So these are some of the things and steps that I think that we could take.
If I can go briefly, I was just going to add to that and say, I think the other thing that we're missing is, again, the role that the government plays in providing housing for folks who are not met by the market. And so Toronto Community Housing is still struggling to revitalize or go through the process of revitalizing its portfolio because it is in such a deep state of disrepair, tens of billions of dollars. And currently the approach is to do it on an as-needed basis. So once a crisis strikes a neighborhood, it is then the time that TCH acts to reinvest in said community, because there is no large role from the federal government. There is certainly not in Ontario a major provincial role in funding public housing or social housing more broadly. And so as we think about what's happening on the ground in communities like Little Jamaica and in Chinatown, folks across the city, especially in our inner suburban communities who are marginalized, are predominantly renting, are racialized, are stuck in these systems where they are being systematically displaced, and they are either becoming homeless or they are finding themselves in other parts of the GTHA, away from their family, away from their friends, away from their communities. And so there is a really important role that the City of Toronto has in using its lands that currently exist to make sure that folks can remain in their communities while providing new and better care in affordable housing projects, as well as, again, just investment. The provincial government has all of these sweeping provincial policy changes, all to increase housing supply more broadly. No public investment in new public housing. There's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah, I do want to move to our question on the Bill 23, but Julie, please wrap up this question for us.
No, I think that's a great segue into Bill 23, but also just to build on sort of what Nemoy was saying too, in terms of what is the role of academics in helping community groups with, say, research needs and capacity, and just having that ability to say, if you do have access to the data in terms of evictions, then you can understand where concentrations are occurring, and then you can be more proactive in actually addressing that, and then helping the city to understand where transit-led displacement might be happening and how that's occurring is also an important piece. And then, of course, the structural changes that are needed in terms of vacancy, decontrol, and getting rid of that, and just like tightening up all of the sort of the making that the tenant-landlord regime a little bit more friendly for tenants. Would definitely go a long way in terms of just preventing evictions, which actually helps preserve existing affordable rental housing. And then I think maybe that segues the segue into the fact that Bill 23, where it's actually threatening rental replacement bylaws and the demolition control. So that's a huge issue. In addition to IZ caps and all the different development charges, and so forth. So I'll let you start.
Let me read my preamble here. Thank you, Julie. And I just encourage everyone, if you are drawing on policy jargon like IZ, things like that, maybe just give a very brief explanation for our audience here. So yes, the province recently did pass Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act. This act allows for housing development to occur without much public input and limits public appeal processes. It limits the ability of municipalities to apply development charges and is intended for swift and quick housing development. And it's related also to this consultation that's now opened into opening up parts of the Greenbelt for development too. So what are your thoughts on this new legislation? If you're familiar with it, I suspect you are. And what do you think the impacts will be? But also, please just talk about it as much as you want in any way. You might as well go ahead, Julie.
Oh, okay.
Get us started.
Just in terms of, they want to increase supply. That's all well and good, and I think Alan and others have noted that, it's the type of supply too. Like, they don't actually have new funding for truly affordable housing, but also they're saying we're reducing these fees, we're reducing these development charges, but then how are you making sure that you're then passing on those savings to purchasers? So that's one issue. They don't really talk about that. But then the issue for me is really like the rental replacement review that they want to do, which is they want to, the question on the comment webpage is like, what are the impacts of rental replacement bylaws on housing construction? So you kind of see the purpose behind what they are trying to do in this review to standardize replacement bylaws. So in order to control what municipalities can actually compel developers to do. So that's a huge issue. In the city of Toronto, I think the numbers since, well, if we just go back, there was a Rental Housing Protection Act that was in the 90s that was repealed in 98 by the Mike Harris Conservatives. So then when the City of Toronto Act in 2006 came into play, then under Section 111, you could actually then control demolitions. And then that's where you can say, okay, as a condition for this, if the building has, 6 or more rental units, then, and they are at affordable and mid-range rents, then you would need to replace them, right? Actually, under the Rental Housing Protection Act, it was at 5 units was the limit, right? So it was even much better protection. But I always wonder, I worry about then what happened to all of the ones that were below that threshold as well. How many have really been lost? So then you're not preserving the existing stock. So if you're not preserving the existing stock, that can be lost, and then you're increasing supply, but what type of supply are you really adding? And we can talk about IZ after, but I'm a bit hot about that. That it really touches on all of the, in terms of inclusionary zoning, the cap of 5% of set-asides, and just like the length of affordability that they're lowering it to 25 years.
And I think the definition of affordability is just 80% of market, right?
It's tied to market now, but then if you think about it, so then all of this investment, all the public investment that goes into it is then lost after 25 years. What have you gained? What does the public get in return for all of its support? That this can then be lost after 25 years.
I'm just going to jump in to say, like, I definitely agree with a lot of the things that Julie said. I definitely think that, when we think about, even taxpayers' dollars that are invested in infrastructure to help, provide to help connect the city, is actually causing folks to be displaced. And one of the other things that I'm doing with my own research is looking at how public infrastructure investment is acting as an anchor for developers and for financialized landlords to invest in particular geographies of the city. And through this research, we've also been examining development applications since 2012, I believe. And one of the things that when we speak about the Little Jamaica community, there have been a number of development applications that have been proposed for this particular area. And you'd be shocked to see that 77% of the development applications for this particular area are for condominiums, and only 1% is for affordable housing. This area is actually also was not included in the new IZ, so inclusionary zoning. And one of the things I argued with the city was that you're essentially engaging in a more reactive rather than proactive, and the data actually shows that. But the city argues that the economics isn't there to support or to mandate developers to build affordable or a lot affordable housing in their developments along a transit line. Could you believe that? And I'm very up in arms about that. But I also think with respect to what Julie was saying, even the reduction from in terms of how long that these units remain affordable from 99 years to 25. I think that affordable, especially for the corporate welfare that we're providing to these developers, I definitely think that we should be asking for more in terms of these units should remain affordable in perpetuity, because what's going to happen is that we're going to find ourselves in 25 years from now back in the same spot. And then when you have policies like vacancy decontrol, and when you also have policies that in terms of prohibits rent control in units that were built after November the 15th, 2018, it makes you think about how many units are you actually gaining. And then when you have vacancy decontrol, we're not thinking about as what Julie talked about in terms of the preservation of these preservation of the last remaining affordable housing stock that we do have in this city. So as much as that we're building supply, we're also losing because of these particular policies. And one of the things that there's such a fixation on supply, but we never talk about income. We never talk about actually, how are people going to afford some of these new units that you're actually building? And what policies do you have in place to help to increase wages and salaries in the city so that people can actually afford some of the units that you're actually building? We know that construction costs are on the rise. So I'm curious to understand in terms of how is supply going to help people, Canadians, afford the homes that you're actually building. I'll leave it there.
I'm just going to say that also, as we think about transit-oriented development and the role of these major transit station areas, as a part of this process, the provincial government is also looking for municipalities to completely upzone all of the areas within these radii. And within these new targets, it means that less and less developers now need to go through a public process that scrutinizes these projects. And also related to this is there's less community benefits now being provided through charges as a result of one, now including existing gross floor area calculations in what qualifies for the charge. If those projects are, if at all, providing affordable housing per the AMR definition. And so there's now, and previously there was the restriction on third-party appeals, which has since been walked back as a result of public outcry. It still applies to, I think, it no longer applies to everything except site plan control. Don't quote me on that, but there's one thing it no longer applies to. And so overall, you see less public process and due diligence and scrutiny beyond, communities organizing publicly opposed to it. There are less avenues for democratically structured intervention in these processes, which is also concerning.
I've been in a very community-facing role about this bill that is extremely confusing because it's so long, because it's such an incredible Christmas wish list for developers. One of my board chairs joked that it's called the More Homes Built Faster Act. It might as well be called the Evict Tenants Faster Act, or the More Poor People Faster Act, or the Less Wetlands and it's. I think Sean from Union Co-op also made this joke, but it's unclear whether Bill 23 is worse for farms, the environment, animals, poor people in general. It's all of it. They get all of it. It's incredible. And it feels like I started the community-facing engagement about Bill 23 with these incredibly laborious, into the weeds, like, here's exactly what they're proposing, and here's exactly why it's wrong. And at some point I was like, this is a distraction. This is a bad use of our time. This is a way to literally waste our time. I am not going to go through all of the minutia of why Bill 23 is so horrific, because it has so many layers that it's like just, it's truly, truly amazing that it exists in the way that it is. And instead I have offered the congruent logic that Julia has identified, is that they believe that if you supply magically, you could build your way out of the housing crisis, and that affordability is magically solved by building more units, and then there's like this magical supply and demand curve, like in Econ 101, and then the price will come down because you've built more units. And it's like none of them ever actually passed Econ 101. And what I would like you to do in response to supply side bros telling you that this is totally gonna work is you should put on your most condescending voice and be like, let me explain the concept of elasticity to you. Let me explain how you could have a demand curve or a supply curve that is infinitely vertical, and you could build an infinite amount of units. And because housing isn't actually housing people, it's an investment vehicle, it's a product, there is an infinite capacity for people to buy that supply. So there is no amount, that is how the actual market works. It's not you and I buying housing to live in, it's people investing in it, and therefore you could build into infinity, and people would be able to buy into infinity, and nothing would ever happen to the price. Just use your most condescending voice when you explain that to people. That is what I want from all of your interactions for Bill 23, and if you need like a hacked way to explain why exactly it's bad to people.
This is the perfect hot take to take away from this. If you remember one thing. I want to get in a quick thank you to Emily Power, who really saw this report through to the end and did all of the And I'd like to also just say thank you so much to Sunny Singh for the beautiful illustrations. And Alina, please join me in thanking our panelists. We've really
And thank you, Emily Hawes, for moderating such a wonderful class. I would like to invite Karen Chapple, the director of the School of Cities, to close with some remarks.
I've never met Alan in person. We've been on many Teams, Zooms, you name it, WebExes even. Anyway, nice to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you as well.
So, great to see you all here. You know, I'm just so proud of what you have achieved here, Alan and Sue. So 3 years ago, I guess, Maddie can tell us better. You know, my predecessors, Mark Fox and Maddie Simitiki, said, hey, we're the School of Cities. We ought to be doing something about housing. And thus came about the Affordable Housing Challenge project. And there were a couple major goals which I think have been met. One was to bring in multidisciplinary voices into the affordable housing problem. So there's health, there's sociology, there's geography, there's planning, there's architecture, probably more than that. And the second was really to bring some new ideas and new thinking. And I think that was accomplished too. And then to get it out there in an accessible form that the general public could understand and utilize, which is exactly what the mission of the School of Cities is. So, and along the way, there were two wonderful, well, actually probably more than that, but two wonderful side effects that I can think of right away, which is that it helped mentor and raise up the voices of a number of young scholars and funded work for many research assistants, got experience for Emily and Jeremy in publishing, and really launched the careers, I hope, of this the wonderful team. And now I forgot my last thought. The, oh, the Kensington Market Community Land Trust. That was my last thought. So, and Chiyi's here. We haven't met in person either, I don't think. So, one of the great side effects is that the work of Sue and the work on the thinking about land trusts and the hard work of Chiyi to get it together resulted in this wonderful Kensington Market Community Trust. About it. She's the star. It's on our website at the School of Cities, so tells the story. Jorge Davies did it for us, and it's just wonderful. So, thank you all for coming. And if you want to get Thank you, Karen. Just to tag on to Emily Hawes' thank yous, we do have a number of thank yous to give because it is a launch of a report, and as such, there are many people to thank in the production of the report as well as the production of tonight's event. So before we wrap up, we would like to thank Mark Fox, who is professor of Engineering at UC and the former research director of the School of Cities, and as Karen mentioned, it was he who really in 2019 first thought of the idea of a comprehensive report on affordable housing with the contribution of U of T researchers from a variety of different disciplines, and who really fully entrusted Alan and I to run with this idea. So thank you, Mark, for doing that, and I think it paid off. So 3 years later. Next, we want to thank Emily Hawes, who took on the first job of reaching out to report authors, collating and organizing chapter contributions and chapter editing, which is not for those of you who do editing, you know it's not an easy task. This was, in fact, a mammoth task that went smoothly because of Emily's keen eye, attention to detail, kindness and patience, and remarkable sense of calmness, which you can see tonight in her moderating. Thank you, Emily, for all of your hard work and your support over the past 2 years, all while working also on your PhD, which is pretty remarkable, I think. Thank you to Emily Power, our trustee project coordinator and master's in planning student here at U of T, who is also very well organized. We have a really well organized team who support us. She's calm in the face of pressure and impressively thoughtful and detail oriented. Emily keeps us on the ball and on pace for everything. She was key in finishing up this report, doing the stellar work of its design and its layout, facilitating the wonderful illustrations that Sunny did, and for arranging report printing, which is also a huge task, carrying all those reports. So thank you, Emily, for being so incredibly super. I think Sunny was already thanked, but we would like to thank you again, Sunny. I was so happy to meet you in person because I received a lot of emails about this report. The first line was always, the illustrations are so fantastic. And they really are. So thank you. You created these fabulous illustrations. They perfectly sum up each of the chapter sections in just incredibly profound ways. So thank you. You're multi-talented and I bow to you. Thank you. You're really great. Please do look up Sunny's in illustrations. Thank you to Loren March, Jeremy Withers, Sean Grisdale, all PhD students at UT who are also project members and have done a fabulous job of coordinating media outreach about the report and organizing tonight's event. The AHCP, is a collective, and it always feels this way, being surrounded and working with this fantastic group of people. And lastly, thank you to all the chapter contributors who I see in the audience for being here tonight and for dedicating your thoughts, research, and time to the creation of this report. 3 years after its inception, this idea has come to fruition, it's been birthed, and we are really happy to see it come to life. It would not be this way without your critical and insightful comments and thoughts on this very important topic. So with that, we go forth and hopefully really start to activate a lot of the ideas that we heard tonight with this fantastic panel.